At the church I used to attend, there was once a fight between the members about how the flag should be placed, the American flag and the Christian flag. The flags had been sitting in the sanctuary for a long time together at the very front, and the big debate was over what they meant. On the one hand, some people thought the flags together represented our Christian nation, and it was a way to represent support for the many veterans, military veterans, that attended our church. On the other hand, many of the other Christians thought that the flags together represented something more sinister, that Christ and the state are at the same level of authority. Both sides argued for their meaning of the flag by appealing to the Holy Spirit. For many Christians, the Holy Spirit is the voice of God, telling them what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. And this was no different. Both sides argued for what they thought the flags meant by appealing to the Holy Spirit. Eventually, some members left our church because the pastors placed both the flags at the back of the sanctuary. Some of them believed that this was essentially sweeping the issue under the rug. So what happened here? Why did this church split up, and why was there this conflict in the first place? I think before we can answer that question, we have to identify what kind of battle this was. And I think that this was a spiritual battle. This conflict wasn't about the physical placement of the flags, but it was about what the physical placement of the flags meant. Fundamentally, this conflict arose because each side was depending on faith in order to defend their argument. Both sides had faith in what the Holy Spirit was telling them, and since the Holy Spirit can't be seen, touched, heard, etc., there was no way to actually validate what the Holy Spirit was telling everybody unanimously. And as a result, everyone had differing opinions, which they both believed was true on faith, and as a result, this conflict was created, continued, and eventually led to what the pastors did, leading to the division and the schism of the church. The problem is that both sides were wrong, and this led to the destruction of very real values that would be present at the church if this conflict didn't happen. For example, there was a real possibility of love at the church, but because people were fighting over this petty issue about what the flags meant, they really couldn't come together and engage in fellowship or companionship. And this led to the disintegration of the church before my eyes. Another value that was lost due to this faith-based conflict was the value of independence. Instead of relying on their own minds, each of the members relied on what they thought the Holy Spirit was telling them. And this led to conflict that could never be resolved because each person was relying on what amounted to an argument from authority. Another spiritual value that was lost was self-esteem. All of us need confidence, but when you have a conflict that you don't resolve, you lose confidence in yourself. And this is what I saw happen in the church. This conflict fundamentally emerged from the faith-based approach that everyone took to trying to resolve the conflict. And as a result, many real spiritual values like love, independence, self-esteem, and many more were lost. What could have solved this conflict was a reason-based approach to spirituality. Instead of relying on what they each believed the Holy Spirit was telling them, they could rely on the facts for them. Reason is our spirit's ability to identify facts of reality and then integrate them into principles that we can use to make decisions. In this case, if each believer went by reason and identified that the reason the conflict occurred was because each individual was going by faith in what they thought the Holy Spirit was telling them, then this issue could have been more easily resolved. They could have seen that, hey, it looks like we're disagreeing because we are just assuming what the flags mean. But it turns out that it really is up for our interpretation what the flags mean. And that this doesn't really, and what the flags mean doesn't necessarily need to lead to conflict and the dissolution of our community and of the relationships that we would rather keep. This is just a preliminary taste of what reason can do when applied in a spiritual context. And I think that if we want to resolve conflicts like this, faith-based ones, then we need to apply reason as vigorously as we can. Spirituality is ultimately the pursuit and achievement of our non-physical values. Values such as independence, love, self-esteem, and much more. In order to overcome the conflict that comes out of faith-based approaches to obtaining these needs, we need to apply reason to identify what we actually need to do here on earth to obtain those needs. With that said, look for opportunities in your life to apply reason. Look for opportunities to see where faith might be getting involved. And instead, rely on what is actually before you. Is this symbolism really something to fight over? Is this issue really something that would be factually based? Or is it something that people are just making up? If you ask yourself these questions, you'll begin to notice that there's a lot of conflicts that don't really need to exist. And in fact, what we really need is to look at what we need, not what other people say we need or what some guy in the sky says we need. The Spirit isn't something we need to depend on faith in order to grasp. The Spirit is simply the sum of all the non-physical aspects of ourselves, which includes our reason, our emotional faculty, our moral character, our values, and a lot more.